He was hiding behind his own bedroom door when he heard his son cry for the third time in that hour. No one went. Renato Cavalcante was 42 years old, had a fortune that few could spend in 3 lifetimes, and a certainty that was beginning to fall apart right there, in that dark hallway, as the baby's crying echoed through the mansion and his wife didn't move from the couch. He was supposed to be in Dubai. That's what Isabela believed. That's what everyone believed. The trip had been announced in advance, bags packed, driver called. But Renato didn't board. He stayed. He came back through the back entrance with a spare key he had never used, went up the service stairs, and settled into the guest room on the 3rd floor without anyone knowing. 3 days. That was all he needed. The idea had been born 3 weeks earlier, when he got home earlier than expected and found his son, Theo, 8 months old, alone in the crib hungry. Isabela was in the living room, headphones on a video call with someone who hung up far too quickly when they realized he had walked in. She said she had just checked on the baby. Theo had been crying long enough for his throat to go hoarse. Renato said nothing that day. He kept it. But the image of his son with a red face from crying never left his mind. And he started paying attention to things he had ignored before. The way Isabela held Theo, always in a hurry, always passing through. The way she handed the baby over to Conceicao, the housemaid, barely finishing receiving him. How she was never present at pediatric appointments, but appeared impeccable at any social dinner. Something was wrong. He needed to see it with his own eyes. Conceicao was 53 years old, black, from a small town in the countryside, and had been working in the house for 2 years. Renato barely knew her last name. He paid a fair salary, respected her hours, but had never really looked at that woman. She was part of the structure of the house, like the furniture and the security system. That perception, he would discover in the following days, said much more about him than about her. On the first night in hiding, it was Conceicao who got up at 2 in the morning when Theo woke up. Renato heard footsteps in the hallway, peeked through the crack in the door. He saw the woman pick up the baby with a gentleness that seemed like ancient instinct. He saw her sway slowly, hum something softly, wait until the boy closed his eyes again before placing him back in the crib with the care of someone laying down something sacred. Isabela didn't show up. The next morning, Renato stayed watching through the internal camera he had in the room, a device he himself had installed months earlier for security reasons and that Isabela never knew existed. He saw his wife enter the baby's room, look at Theo, who was awake and smiling, and leave without picking him up, without changing a diaper, without anything. 30 seconds inside the room. Less time than it would take to warm a bottle. It was Conceicao again, who entered right after and spent 40 minutes with the boy. She changed him, fed him, placed him on the activity mat, lay down beside him on the floor making funny noises until he burst into laughter. Renato watched everything and felt his stomach turn. But what happened in the afternoon of that second day was what truly broke something inside him. Something he didn't expect. Something that, when it happened, left him standing still, unable to breathe for a long moment, and that would only fully make sense hours later, when the final piece fit together in a way he never would have imagined. He still didn't know what he was about to discover about the woman he had slept beside for the past 4 years. But the clock was already ticking. If you're enjoying this story, subscribe to the channel and leave a like, and tell us in the comments what you think and which city or country you're watching from. It helps a lot. The afternoon of the second day began with a silence that was deceptive. Theo was sleeping. The house had that weekend stillness that looks like peace but sometimes hides something else. Renato was in the guest room, lying on the mattress without making a sound, when he heard Isabela talking on the phone in the hallway just below. Her voice was low, but the mansion's marble flooring carried sound in a way she had never noticed. He didn't understand the words at first. Only the tone. And the tone was already enough to make something tighten in his chest. Isabela was 36 years old and the kind of woman who knew exactly the effect she had in any environment. The daughter of a middle-class family that had gone bankrupt when she was 18, she grew up learning that appearance was currency. Not in a cynical way, or at least that's what Renato believed. He had always interpreted her elegance as genuine sophistication, the attention she gave to her own image as self-esteem, the emotional distance as restraint. 4 years of marriage build narratives. And we defend the narratives we've built because tearing them down is expensive. The call lasted 22 minutes. Renato timed it without realizing, staring at the ceiling. When she hung up, he stayed still for a while longer, and then heard the familiar sound of heels on marble heading toward the master bedroom. Drawer opening. Perfume. Drawer closing. She left half an hour later. Renato went to the window and saw her car leave through the garage without hurry, like someone going to the market. Theo woke up 15 minutes later. He cried for 3 minutes before Conceicao appeared. Renato went down the internal hallway carefully and stood in the stairwell, from where he could see the kitchen without being seen. Conceicao was holding the boy in her arms, preparing mashed fruit with one hand while balancing Theo on the other arm with the ease of someone who had done it hundreds of times. She murmured something to the baby while she worked. It wasn't a song. It was conversation. She was talking to him as if Theo understood every word. "Today it's a beautiful sunny day outside," she said softly. "We're going to see that sun later, my dear. Let me give you something tasty first." Theo opened his mouth before the spoon arrived. He smiled with his mouth full. Renato stood there in the stairwell, watching that scene longer than he intended. There was something about it that hurt in a specific way, not anger, not yet. It was a deeper pain, the kind that shows up when you realize you've been wrong about something important for a long time. He went back to the guest room and started thinking about Conceicao. He knew very little about her. He vaguely remembered that she was a widow, that she had daughters, 2 or 3, he wasn't sure. He remembered that once she had asked for a day off to deal with something at one of their schools, and Isabela had said yes with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. It was the kind of detail he hadn't registered at the time because it wasn't relevant to his life. Now that detail took up space. Isabela came back in the late afternoon with shopping bags. She entered, left the bags in the living room, passed by the baby's room without going in, and went straight to shower. She had dinner alone because Theo was already asleep and Conceicao had gone to her small room in the back. She stayed at the table with her phone in hand, typing, smiling at the screen with an intimacy that didn't match any business conversation. Renato saw everything through the camera. It wasn't the first time he suspected. It had been a fleeting thought dismissed, on 2 separate occasions in recent months. The mind protects what we've built. It discards what threatens it. He was good at that. He had learned in the business world that selective focus is a tool, without understanding that in marriage the same tool becomes a trap. Now there was no way to discard it anymore. The name that appeared repeatedly on her phone screen, he managed to see it from the angle of the living room camera, was a name he knew. It wasn't a stranger. It wasn't someone outside their circle. It was someone close enough that the discovery would change not only the marriage, but several other things around him. Renato turned off the camera and stayed in the dark for a long time. Tomorrow would be the 3rd day. The last one. And he still didn't know what Conceicao had kept inside that worn cloth bag she carried every day, and which, the next morning, would completely change the direction of everything. The morning of the 3rd day arrived with a light rain. Renato woke up before 6, without an alarm, with that strange clarity that sometimes comes after a night when you didn't really sleep but your brain worked the whole time. He lay there for a few minutes staring at the ceiling of the guest room, listening to the rain hitting the window and the silence of the house around him. He had made a decision during the night. Not in a dramatic way, not with anger vibrating in his chest. In a cold, clear, and irreversible way, the same way he made the most important decisions in business. When emotion fades and what remains is only naked reality, without the layer of hope we put on top to keep going. The reality was this: his son was being raised by a stranger. The woman he was married to was with another man. And he had spent 4 years building a life on something that had never truly existed. Now he needed to act. But act correctly. The first thing he did was quietly call Dr. Fernanda Aoki, his personal lawyer, with whom he had worked for 8 years. It was 6:20 in the morning and she answered on the second ring, because she knew Renato well enough to understand that a call at that hour wasn't something small. He spoke for 17 minutes. She listened to almost everything without interrupting. When he finished, she asked 3 objective questions and said she would be at the office by 8 with the necessary team. She also said, and this he didn't forget, that she was sorry. Not as protocol. As a person. Renato hung up and stayed for a moment with the phone against his chest. Then he got up. Conceicao's bag was on the hook near the kitchen door, where she always left it when she arrived. A brown canvas bag, worn at the handles, with a colorful plastic keychain hanging from the zipper. The kind of keychain a small child chooses to give as a gift. Renato had seen it hundreds of times without really noticing it. That morning, as he went down the service stairs before anyone woke up, He passed by the bag and stopped. He didn't open it. It wouldn't be right. But he looked at that simple object for a second and thought about everything Conceicao carried in it every day. Literally, and in other ways he was beginning to understand. He went to the living room and accessed the camera system through the tablet, reviewing the recordings of the 3 days in a systematic way. He had enough footage. Enough moments. He didn't need much. The reality had been consistent enough to document itself. Theo crying without response. Isabela leaving. Conceicao arriving. The sequence repeated with a regularity that hurt to watch compressed on a screen. He exported the files to an encrypted external server that only he could access. He sent them to Dr. Fernanda with a short message. Then he went to Theo's room. The boy was still sleeping. Renato stood at the edge of the crib for a length of time he couldn't measure. Theo had his father's face, the nose, the shape of the forehead, but he slept with a calm Renato had never had. One hand open facing up, the other closed near his face. Small, steady breathing. He slowly placed his open hand on his son's chest, just to feel it. He stayed like that until Theo moved slightly, then removed his hand carefully and left the room without making a sound. Conceicao arrived at 7:30, as always. Renato was in the kitchen when she entered through the back door, and for a second, the two looked at each other. She with the expression of someone who had just seen a ghost, he with the heavy awareness of a man who had spent 3 days spying on his own house. "Good morning, Conceicao," he said. She stood still with the bag on her shoulder, not understanding. "Weren't you traveling, sir?" "I was," he replied. "Now I'm not anymore." She nodded slowly, without asking questions, with the discretion of someone who has learned that other people's lives are rarely what they seem. She hung the bag on the hook, washed her hands, and went to check on Theo. Renato watched her go and thought about asking about her daughters. About school. About the colorful plastic keychain. He didn't ask yet, but he made a mental note that he would. Soon. What he still didn't know was that Conceicao had been carrying something inside that bag for weeks. Something she had never had the courage to show anyone. But that morning, for a reason she herself wouldn't be able to fully explain, she would finally decide to take out. It was 10 in the morning when Conceicao took the notebook out of her bag. Renato was sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee that had gone cold when she returned from Theo's room, stopped at the entrance of the living room, and stood there looking at him with an expression he couldn't immediately classify. It wasn't fear. It wasn't ordinary hesitation. It was the face of someone who has been carrying something for too long and has reached the limit of its weight. "I need to show you something," she said, without the sir. For the first time, he looked at her. Conceicao took from her bag a medium-sized black-covered notebook, its edges already worn from so much handling. She placed it on the table in front of Renato without explaining anything yet, just stood on the other side with her hands clasped in front of her body. He opened it. It was a diary. Not hers. The handwriting was different, slanted, small, pressed hard into the paper like someone writing with urgency. Renato read the first line of the first page and something ran down his spine like cold water. It was Isabela's handwriting. Conceicao explained in a few words. She had found the notebook 3 weeks earlier, under the mattress in the master bedroom, when she changed the protector. She had read the first lines unintentionally and then couldn't stop. She kept it without knowing what to do. She had no proof of anything beyond Isabela's own words written there, and she knew that a maid presenting her employer's diary meant little without context. She waited. She kept it. She carried it. Renato turned the pages slowly. Isabela had been writing for at least 8 months. The notebook documented, with a brutal honesty that only exists when we believe no one will ever read it, what she really felt. About the marriage, empty, convenient, financially secure. About Theo, a planning mistake, her words, that she never managed to turn into genuine love no matter how hard she tried, and then she stopped trying. About the man she had been seeing, and the name there was complete, no code, no nickname. Rodrigo Feitosa. Renato's minority partner in 2 companies. Best man at their wedding. Renato closed the notebook. He stared at the table for a few seconds that seemed to last differently than normal time. Conceicao said nothing. There was nothing to say that the silence hadn't already said. Then he picked up his phone and called Dr. Fernanda. "There's more," he said when she answered. "I'm going to send you photos of a document. You'll understand when you see it." He photographed each page of the notebook. Sent them. Waited. The lawyer called back in 4 minutes. What happened in the following hours was fast in the way only things that are very well prepared can be. Dr. Fernanda had already structured the divorce petition since 8 in the morning. With the notebook, the legal argument became stronger than she needed. The camera recordings documented negligence. The notebook documented intent. Together, they formed a picture no judge would ignore. Isabela arrived home at 11:30. She came in through the front door carrying a pharmacy bag and stopped when she saw Renato sitting in the living room. Her face went through 3 expressions in less than 2 seconds: surprise, calculation, forced composure. "Renato, I thought you were in Dubai." "I know what you thought," he replied. She stood still. Something in his tone was different from anything she had heard in 4 years of marriage. There was no anger. There was no volume. It was worse than that, it was distance. The voice of someone who had already gone through the worst alone and come out the other side. He placed the notebook on the coffee table. Isabela looked at the object, and the blood drained from her face in a way Renato had never seen happen to anyone. She recognized the cover before even opening it. She stared at the notebook as if it were something alive. "Where did you?" "It doesn't matter," he interrupted. "Dr. Fernanda will call you this afternoon. You have until tomorrow to contact a lawyer. I've already left the master bedroom. I'll stay on the 3rd floor with Theo until the situation is legally resolved." She tried to speak. He stood up slowly. "There's no need to explain anything, Isabela. You explained everything yourself." He turned his back and went up the stairs. In the 2nd floor hallway, he passed by Theo's bedroom door and heard Conceicao's voice inside, telling a story in a low voice while the boy listened. He stopped for a second, took a deep breath. Then he knocked lightly on the door and went in. The divorce was finalized in 43 days. Isabela did not contest custody. Maybe because she knew she had no argument. Maybe because part of her felt a relief she would never admit out loud. The exit from a life she herself had written in the notebook as suffocating. She signed the documents on a Tuesday afternoon, in a glass meeting room downtown, with 2 lawyers on each side and the kind of silence that exists when there is nothing left to negotiate. Renato left the office that day without celebrating. It wasn't victory. It was closure. There is a big difference between the two, and he learned it in the most expensive way possible. Theo stayed with him. Full custody, supervised visits for Isabela if she requested them. She never did, at least not in the first months. Rodrigo Feitosa received a formal notice of dissolution of partnership 3 days after the divorce was signed, for reasons the documents described as strategic incompatibility and that anyone close understood without needing explanation. Renato sold the mansion. It wasn't a financial decision. It was an emotional hygiene decision. Those walls had held too many things he didn't want Theo to grow up breathing in. He bought a smaller house in a quieter neighborhood, with a dirt yard and a real tree, the kind of place that impresses no one but has space for a child to run. It was during that conversation, the one about the new house, that he finally asked Conceicao about her daughters. Their names were Beatriz and Dandara, 15 and 12 years old. They lived with their grandmother in a town 4 hours away because Conceicao couldn't afford rent close enough to bring them with her. She visited once a month when she could afford the trip. Sometimes she couldn't. Renato listened to all of this sitting at the temporary kitchen table in the apartment where they stayed during the transition, while Theo crawled on the rug between them. He listened without interrupting, the same way Conceicao had listened to him speaking with Dr. Fernanda weeks earlier. When she finished, he stayed silent for a moment. "How much do you pay in rent where they are?" She gave him a number. He nodded. "What if they came to live here? With you?" "The new house has a room." Conceicao stopped speaking. She looked at him with an expression he couldn't describe at the time, but that stayed with him. It was the face of someone who had gone so long without expecting anything that they no longer knew how to receive. "You don't have to do this, sir," she said. "I know," he replied. "But you spend 40 minutes lying on the floor making funny noises to make my son smile. Your daughters deserve to have their mother close." She didn't answer. She lowered her head. Renato looked the other way to give her space. Beatriz and Dandara arrived on a Friday with 3 suitcases and their grandmother, who stayed for the weekend to see where her granddaughters would live. The grandmother inspected every room in the house with a seriousness that made Renato feel like he was being evaluated, and he was. On Sunday night, before leaving, she called him aside in the kitchen, looked him straight in the eyes, and said a short sentence he would repeat to himself many times afterward. Take care of them the way you want someone to take care of your son. He promised. And he meant it. The months that followed were different from anything Renato had known. Not better in every aspect. There were difficult days, real exhaustion, the weight of raising a small child without a partner, the loneliness that appears at 10 at night when the house becomes quiet. But there was also something the mansion never had, no matter how big it was. Presence. Theo grew up hearing 3 different voices speaking to him throughout the day. He learned to crawl on a rug where Dandara did homework and Beatriz listened to music. He took his first steps toward Conceicao on a Saturday afternoon, while Renato filmed from the other side of the room with his hand shaking from emotion. It wasn't the family he had planned. It was better than anything he would have been able to plan. One night, after Theo fell asleep, Renato sat in the yard looking at the tree his son was still too small to climb. He thought about everything he had lost. He thought about everything he had found without looking. He thought about Conceicao, who never asked for recognition and always gave the best she had. He thought about her daughters, who slept a few meters away with their mother under the same roof for the first time in years. Family is not what you build with money. It's not what shows up in travel photos or at the right dinners. Family is what remains when everything that was false goes away. It's who is there at 2 in the morning when the baby cries. It's who lies on the floor just to see a child smile. It's who carries a heavy notebook for weeks because they don't know how to help but know they have to do something. Renato learned that hiding in his own hallway, spying on his own life. And it was the most important thing he learned in 42 years. If this story touched something inside you, leave a like and subscribe to the channel, and tell us in the comments what you thought and which city or country you're watching from. Your message makes a difference.